The Northmen are born with salt water in their veins. They do not fear the sea. They respect its fury. They ride its waves, and they harvest its bounty. A Viking is taught to read the stars before he can read runes and to understand the wind before he can speak. To them, the ocean is a road to glory, to silver, and to new land. But there is a rule, spoken only in hushed tones by the oldest navigators, the ones whose eyes are milky white and who stare too long at the horizon. Keep the shore in sight, the deep water, the open ocean where the bottom drops away into the eternal black. That does not belong to men. It belongs to the old things, the things that were ancient before the gods were born. Jarl Kaelen did not believe in old men's whispers. He was a man of ambition, a leader of 70 hardened warriors aboard the Iron Storm, a longship of unmatched size and craftsmanship. Its prow was carved into the snarling head of a sea dragon, its hull reinforced with iron bands to crush through pack ice. Kaelen was not sailing to raid the familiar coasts of the Saxons or the Franks. He was seeking a legend. He was sailing west, further than any man had dared, seeking a mythical continent of gold and endless timber. They had been at sea for a month. The morale was high, the mead was flowing, and the winds had been favorable, until the sky turned green. It happened on the 31st day of the voyage. The sun, which had been a bright, comforting eye in the sky, was suddenly swallowed by a bruised, unnatural cloud bank that rolled over the horizon like a solid wall of iron. The wind died instantly. The sail went slack, slapping against the mast with a pathetic sound. The sea became eerily calm, the waves flattening out until the ocean looked like a sheet of dark glass. "Oars out!" Kaelen roared, standing at the helm. "Row us through it." But before the men could even dip their blades, the storm hit. It did not build slowly. It struck with the force of a falling mountain. The wind shrieked, a deafening, physical roar that tore 3 men from the deck and hurled them into the gray void before they could even scream. The iron storm pitched violently, rising on swells that were taller than the mast, only to plunge down into valleys of water that threatened to snap the keel in two. "Tie yourselves down. Hold fast." Kaelen bellowed over the roar, lashing himself to the steering oar. "Hold fast." For 3 days and 3 nights, they existed in a purgatory of water and wind. There was no day, no night, just a continuous, chaotic blender of freezing rain, black waves and lightning that tore across the sky in jagged purple streaks. They bailed water until their hands bled, their muscles tearing from the exertion. 10 more men were claimed by the sea, swallowed by the frothing maw of the ocean. They lost their provisions, they lost their bearings, they lost their minds to the sheer, deafening terror of the storm. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm stopped. Kaelen opened his eyes. He was slumped over the steering oar, his body bruised and battered. The silence that woke him was so absolute it hurt his ears. He unlashed himself and stood up on trembling legs. He looked around the deck. The mast was cracked but holding. 57 men remained, exhausted, groaning, coughing up seawater. But it was the sea itself that made Kaelen's blood run cold. The water was no longer the deep, vibrant blue of the North Sea. It was black, a matte, featureless obsidian black that absorbed all light. There were no whitecaps. There were no ripples. The surface was perfectly, impossibly smooth, like a pool of spilled ink stretching endlessly in every direction. There was no sun to gauge the time, no stars to read the direction, just a flat, oppressive dome pressing down on them. There was no wind, not a single breath of air. The air smelled strange, stale, metallic, and incredibly old. It smelled like the air inside a sealed tomb. Where are we, Jarl?" whispered Eric, Kaelen's second-in-command, pulling himself up onto the gunwale. He looked at the black water with wide, terrified eyes. "I don't know," Kaelen admitted, his voice sounding small and fragile in the vast silence. Kaelen grabbed a sounding line, a long rope with a heavy lead weight attached to the end, used to measure the depth of the water. He needed to know if they were near a coast, near a reef, near anything. He threw the lead weight overboard. It hit the black water with a hollow plop, leaving a strange, slow-moving ripple that seemed reluctant to fade. The rope spooled out of Kaelen's hands. 10 fathoms, 20, 50. 100. Usually, the weight would hit the bottom, the rope would go slack, and they would know where they stood. But the rope kept unspooling. 200 fathoms, 300. "We are over the abyss," Eirik muttered, crossing himself in the old way, a gesture to gods he hoped were still watching. The rope was nearing its end. 400 fathoms. It was the longest-sounding line they had. He gripped the end of the rope tightly, preparing to pull it back up. Suddenly, the rope jerked. It wasn't a gentle tug. It was a massive, violent pull, as if the lead weight had been snatched by the hand of a giant. Kaelen was yanked forward, his chest slamming against the wooden rail. "Help me," Kaelen grunted, his boots sliding on the wet deck. Eirik and 2 other men rushed over, grabbing the thick hemp rope. They planted their feet and pulled. It felt like they were trying to drag an entire island up from the depths. The rope groaned, the fibers stretching and popping under immense tension. "Whatever has it, it's heavy," Eirik yelled, his face turning red with effort. They managed to haul in 10 feet of rope. Then the tension changed. It wasn't just dead weight anymore. It was moving. The rope began to sway slowly, deliberately, from side to side in the water. Something alive was at the other end, something massive, swimming leisurely miles beneath them, casually dragging the ship along with it. "Let it go," Kaelen shouted, realizing the danger. "Cut the line." Before Eirik could draw his knife, the force on the rope multiplied 100-fold. Snap! The thick hemp rope snapped like a brittle twig. The recoil whipped back, striking one of the men in the face and sending him crashing to the deck. Kaelen stumbled backward, breathing heavily. He looked at the frayed end of the rope in his hands. It hadn't just broken. The fibers were crushed, coated in a thick, translucent slime that smelled of rotting fish and ammonia. The men on the ship were silent. The 57 hardened warriors, men who had burned villages and slaughtered armies, stood frozen in absolute terror, staring down into the black mirror of the sea. What was that? What was that? A young oarsman named Ulf whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Nothing," Kaelen lied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The weight caught on a deep current. That is all. Man the oars. We row blindly until we find the wind." The men sat at their benches. They dipped their long wooden oars into the black water. The water felt thick, heavy, resisting the blades like syrup. They rowed for hours in absolute silence. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of the oars and the creaking of the wooden hull. The gray sky did not change. The black sea did not end. It was as if they were suspended in a void, rowing in place, moving neither forward nor backward. As exhaustion began to set in, the terror of the deep began to take root in their minds. Thalassophobia, the primal fear of what lies beneath the surface, is a quiet madness. It starts as a whisper in the back of the mind. How deep is it? What is looking up at us right now? By the time the gray sky darkened slightly, signaling what passed for night in this forsaken place, the men were exhausted. They pulled their oars in. Kaelen ordered half the men to sleep, the other half to keep watch. Though what they were watching for, he didn't know. Eirik sat next to Kaelen at the helm. "The water is wrong, Kaelen. It doesn't reflect the ship. Look." Eirik was right. Usually, even in the darkest water, you could see the blurry reflection of the hull. But this water absorbed the image completely. It was like looking into a black hole. "We will find a way out," Kaelen said softly. "The gods have not abandoned us," Eirik whispered. Just then, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was so profound that it vibrated in the marrow of their bones. It was a low, resonant hum coming from directly beneath the keel of the ship. It sounded like a massive whale song, but distorted, deeper, and filled with a cold, alien intelligence. The vibrations traveled up through the wood of the ship, numbing the soles of their feet. Men woke up from their sleep, grabbing their weapons in a panic. Ulf cried out, looking wildly over the side. "Get away from the rails," Kaelen ordered. The humming continued for a full minute, shaking the ship gently. Then it stopped. The silence rushed back in, somehow even more terrifying than the sound. "Look!" Ulf pointed a shaking finger at the water on the starboard side. Kaelen ran to the center of the ship and looked down over the men's heads. Deep below the surface of the black water, something was illuminating the abyss. It was a pale, sickly green light, glowing like a submerged moon. But it wasn't a moon. It was moving, It was a shape, a shadow gliding effortlessly through the crushing depths, and it was unimaginably huge. The Iron Storm was a massive longship, nearly 100 feet long. The glowing shape passing beneath them made the ship look like a piece of driftwood. It took a full 2 minutes for the shape to glide from the bow of the ship to the stern. It was a mile long, maybe more. They couldn't see eyes, they couldn't see teeth or scales, just a colossal glowing silhouette, moving with the terrifying grace of a predator in its own domain. As the tail end of the massive glowing shape finally faded into the black depths ahead of them, the water around the ship suddenly churned, rose to the surface, and burst right next to the hull. It released a cloud of gas that smelled of ancient decay and brimstone, and amidst the frothing water of the burst bubble, something was left floating on the surface, something small, something white. Kaelen grabbed a boat hook and reached out, hooking the object and pulling it aboard. It fell onto the wooden deck with a wet thud. The men gathered around it, raising their lanterns. It was a human skull, but it wasn't an ancient relic. The bone was fresh, bits of flesh still clinging to the cheekbones, and the skull was crushed, cracked open like a walnut, the brain completely hollowed out. Eirik looked at the skull, then looked out at the endless black ocean. "We are not alone," Eirik whispered, his voice cracking. "And whatever is down there, it's hungry." The skull lay on the wet wooden deck, a stark, pale contrast to the blackened timber of the Iron Storm. The 57 survivors stood in a wide circle around it, the silence broken only by the ragged breathing of terrified men. No one wanted to touch it. No one wanted to acknowledge what it meant. Kaelen knelt beside it. He held up his lantern. The flickering yellow light cast long, dancing shadows within the hollow eye sockets. "Eye socket. Eye," Rick whispered, his voice trembling. He pointed a shaking finger at the bone. The bone is thicker there. It was broken once and healed badly. Kaelen's stomach tightened. He remembered a tavern brawl in Kattegat 3 winters ago. He remembered a massive man named Torvald taking a warhammer to the jaw and surviving. Torvald had been on this ship. Torvald had been swept overboard during the peak of the Green Storm 3 days ago. "It's Torvald," Kaelen confirmed, his voice flat, devoid of the confidence a Jarl should possess. "But Jarl," young Ulf stammered, stepping back. "If Torvald fell overboard 3 days ago, how did his skull get here?" "We were blown hundreds of miles by the wind." Did he swim after us?" "Men do not swim with crushed skulls, boy," Eirik snapped, his eyes wide and feverish. "And look at the bone. It's perfectly clean. No fish bites, no crab marks. Just sucked clean, like marrow from a roasted pig." The implication hung in the heavy, metallic air. Whatever that glowing Leviathan was beneath them, it hadn't just passed by. It had been following them. It had swallowed Torvald days ago, digested his flesh, and now it had spat his crushed skull back up, not as a natural bodily function, but as a message. "Throw it back," Kaelen ordered, standing up abruptly. "Get it off my ship." Eirik used the tip of his spear to push the skull toward the edge. It tumbled over the gunwale and hit the black water. It didn't splash, and it didn't float. The thick, oily black surface of the abyss seemed to open up and swallow the bone, pulling it down with unnatural speed until it vanished into the dark. "We need to move," Kaelen roared, turning to his paralyzed crew. "I don't care that there is no wind. We have oars. We row until our arms fall off. We row until the water turns blue again, to the benches. Now, fear is a powerful whip." They sat in pairs, digging the blades deep into the black water. They pulled with the frantic, desperate energy of prey trying to escape a closing jaw. Heave, ho, ho. The rhythmic chanting of the rowing master echoed across the flat, dead ocean. They rowed for hours. Sweat poured from their faces, mixing with the salt and grime. Their muscles screamed. Their palms blistered and bled against the rough wood. But as Kaelen stood at the stern, watching the wake of the ship, a cold dread washed over him. The water didn't churn behind them. The oars left no trail, no white foam, no lasting ripples. The heavy ship felt as though it was dragging through wet sand, not water. Kaelen looked up at the gray, featureless dome of the sky. He looked at the horizon, which was indistinguishable from the sea, just a seamless blend of dark gray and pitch black. They weren't moving. They were burning their strength, breaking their bodies, but the iron storm was anchored in place by an invisible force. The sea itself was holding them captive. "Hold your oars!" Kaelen finally shouted, his voice cracking. The men collapsed over their benches, gasping for air, their chests heaving. They looked at Kaelen, their eyes begging for a horizon, for a landmark, for a bird in the sky. He had nothing to give them. "Drink," Kaelen ordered softly. "Ration the fresh water. We rest. Then we try again." Eric went below deck to the barrels they had secured during the storm. He returned a few minutes later, his face the color of ash. He held a wooden dipper in his hand. "Jarl," Eric whispered, holding the dipper out. His hand was shaking violently. "The water." Kaelen took the dipper. He brought it to his lips. He expected the stale, woody taste of barrel water. Instead, a thick, metallic liquid filled his mouth. It tasted of sulfur, ancient dust, and copper. It tasted like blood that had been left to rot in the sun. Kaelen spat it out violently, coughing and gagging. He looked at the fluid in the dipper. It was tinged with a faint, sickly green luminescence. It was the same color as the massive shape that had passed beneath them. "All the barrels?" Kaelen asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Every single one," Eric said, tears welling in his hardened eyes. The seals were tight, Kaelen. Men rushed to the barrels, tearing off the lids, only to find the same glowing, corrupted sludge inside. Some men, driven mad by the sheer terror of their situation, tried to drink the black seawater over the side of the ship. Kaelen yelled, tackling a man who was cupping the black ocean water to his mouth. Kaelen pinned the warrior to the deck. "If you drink that, you belong to it. Do you hear me? You will rot from the inside out." The man sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound that no Viking should ever make. "I am so thirsty, Kaelen. The water, it's whispering to me. It says it's sweet. It says it's cold." He looked down at the man's eyes. The pupils were fully dilated, swallowing the iris, making his eyes look as black as the ocean around them. "Who is whispering?" Kaelen demanded, shaking him. "The deep," the man smiled. A terrifying, serene smile that did not reach his dead black eyes. "It knows my name. It knows all our names. It has been waiting for us to fall off the map." Madness is a contagion. In the suffocating silence of the abyss, with no wind, no stars, and no hope, the minds of the men began to fracture. They were warriors built to fight men with swords and axes. They were not built to fight the crushing, infinite emptiness of a dead ocean. Night fell, though it was impossible to tell when the gray sky transitioned to the absolute pitch black of the evening. They lit the lanterns, hanging them along the gunwales. The yellow light struggled against the darkness, illuminating only a few feet of the oily black water around the hull. Beyond that small halo of light, the void was absolute. Kaelen sat by the mast, his heavy sword resting across his knees. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He watched his men. Some sat in tight circles, whispering prayers to Odin, to Thor, to Freyja, but the words sounded empty here. This place felt older than the gods of Asgard. This place belonged to the primordial chaos that existed before the world tree took root. Near the bow of the ship, young Ulf was standing alone. He was leaning far over the railing, staring down into the black water. Kaelen stood up slowly, his muscles aching. He walked toward the boy. "Ulf," Kaelen said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Step back from the rail. The deck is slippery." Ulf didn't turn around. He kept staring down. "Do you see them, Jarl?" Ulf whispered. His voice was calm. "Too calm. Too calm." "See what, boy?" Kaelen stepped closer, gripping the wooden rail tightly. He looked down into the water where Ulf was staring. He saw nothing but the reflection of the lantern and the impenetrable blackness. "The faces," Ulf said, pointing down. "Millions of them, pale and floating just beneath the surface. They are looking up at us. They are smiling." Kaelen squinted, staring hard into the abyss. "There is nothing there, Ulf. Your mind is playing tricks. You are tired and thirsty." "My mother is there," Ulf said, a tear rolling down his cheek. "She died when I was 6, but she's right there. She says it's warm down there. She says the heavy air won't hurt my lungs anymore." "Ulf, listen to me." Kaelen grabbed the boy's shoulder. The boy's flesh felt ice cold through his tunic. "Step away from the edge." "She wants to hold me," Ulf said, before Kaelen could pull him back. Ulf simply let go of the rail. He didn't jump. He didn't dive. He just leaned forward until his center of gravity shifted, and he tumbled over the side. "No," Kaelen roared, lunging forward. He caught a handful of Ulf's cloak, but the fabric tore. Ulf hit the black water. There was no splash. The surface parted like thick oil, absorbing the boy instantly. Kaelen leaned over the side, thrusting his lantern out. "Ulf, grab the rope! Eric, get a hook!" The crew rushed to the side, peering into the dark. Ulf was only 3 feet below the surface. He wasn't thrashing. He wasn't trying to swim up. He was sinking slowly, his arms spread wide, his face turned upward toward the lantern light. His eyes were open, and he was smiling that same terrifying, serene smile. He was exhaling, letting the last of his air escape in a stream of silver bubbles, welcoming the black water into his lungs. "Get the boat hook!" Kaelen yelled, grabbing a long wooden pole with a curved iron spike at the end. He plunged the hook into the water, aiming for Ulf's thick leather belt. The water felt incredibly heavy, fighting the movement of the pole. Kaelen twisted the hook and felt the iron catch on the leather. "I have him," Kaelen grunted, planting his boots against the railing. "Pull, help me pull." Eric and 3 others grabbed the pole. They pulled upward. Ulf's sinking body stopped. They began to drag him back toward the surface. Ulf's smiling face broke the surface of the black water. "Spit it out, boy!" Kaelen yelled, reaching down to grab Ulf's arm. But as Kaelen's fingers brushed Ulf's wet sleeve, the ship lurched violently. The boat hook, thick as a man's wrist, suddenly jerked downward with unstoppable force. The men holding the pole were nearly pulled over the side. The black water around Ulf was changing. The darkness was parting. Rising from the unfathomable depths, moving with terrifying speed, was a shape. It was not a fish. It was not a whale. It was an appendage. It was pale, glowing with that same sickly green light. It was thick as the trunk of an ancient oak tree, but it possessed too many joints, bending and clicking in ways that defied nature. It was covered in translucent, gelatinous flesh, beneath which thick black veins pulsed with an alien heartbeat. It broke the surface of the water without a sound. The men on the ship screamed, backing away, drawing their swords with trembling hands. The pale, multi-jointed monstrosity didn't attack the ship. It gently, almost tenderly, wrapped itself around Ulf's waist. Ulf didn't struggle. His smile widened as the massive, glowing limb coiled around him. "Cut the pole!" Kaelen roared, bringing his sword down on the wooden shaft of the boat hook. The wood splintered, freeing the iron hook. The pale appendage tightened its grip on the boy. And then, with the casual strength of a god plucking a berry from a bush, it pulled. Ulf was yanked down into the black abyss so fast he was a blur. The surface of the water smoothed over instantly, leaving no trace that a man or a monster had ever been there. Kaelen fell back against the mast, his sword slipping from his sweaty grip, clattering onto the deck. The men were weeping openly. Hardened killers, men who had faced down shield walls and charging cavalry, were brought to their knees by the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the horror below them. "It didn't just take him," Eric whispered, staring blankly at the spot where Ulf had vanished. It answered him. He called to it, and it answered. Kaelen looked around his ship. The wood of the deck seemed darker than before. The air was getting thicker, harder to breathe. "Check the hull," Kaelen ordered, his voice hollow. "Check below decks." 2 men scrambled down the hatch into the dark belly of the longship. A minute later, they returned. Their faces were masks of pure despair. "Jarl," one of the men choked out. "The water, it's coming in." "A leak." "Oh." "No," the man sobbed, falling to his knees. "It's not a crack. The wood, the black water is eating it. The hull is softening, Jarl. It feels like wet clay. The sea is digesting the ship." Kaelen walked to the center of the deck. He fell to his knees and pressed his ear against the heavy oak planks. He listened. Beneath the sound of the terrified men, beneath the creaking of the dying wood, he heard it again. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a low hum this time. It was a physical strike. Something massive was pressing itself against the bottom of the iron storm. And then a new sound joined the thumping. A scraping sound, like giant bony fingers slowly dragging along the entire length of the keel, searching for a way in. They were sitting on the back of the Leviathan, and it was waking up. The scraping beneath the hull was the sound of a nightmare made physical. It sounded like a mountain dragging itself across a field of gravel, but amplified 1,000 times by the hollow wood of the iron storm. The entire ship vibrated with the slow, agonizing friction. Dust shook loose from the rafters below deck. The mast groaned in protest. 56 men stood on the deck, their weapons drawn, their eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath their feet. They were waiting for the wood to shatter. They were waiting to fall into the black, waiting maw of the abyss. "What is it doing?" Eric whispered, gripping his spear so tightly his knuckles were white. "Is it trying to break us?" "If it wanted to break us, we would be splinters by now," Kaelen replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He kept his sword lowered, knowing full well that steel was useless against a creature that used the ocean as a blanket. "It's examining us." The scraping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Instead, the water around the ship began to boil, not with heat, but with movement. Massive, sluggish bubbles, each the size of a longboat, rose from the depths and burst on the surface. They released a stench so foul, so redolent of ancient decay and stagnant sulfur, that men began to vomit over the side. The black water frothed and churned, turning the glassy surface into a chaotic, bubbling cauldron. "Look!" The green luminescence they had seen earlier was returning, but this time it was not a single, distant shape. It was everywhere. The black water beneath them was lighting up, revealing a vast, horrifying landscape of pale green flesh. It stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction. The iron storm was not floating above a creature. It was floating directly over its eye, or perhaps a single scale, or a patch of skin. The sheer scale of the thing defied comprehension. It was a continent of living meat. The heavy iron weapon hit the deck with a dull thud. "It's Jormungandr, the world's serpent. We have sailed into the twilight of the gods." "That is no serpent," Kaelen said, his eyes wide, his mind struggling to process the impossible geometry of the glowing mass below. A head, a tail. This has no beginning and no end. It is the sea itself. As they watched, paralyzed by the cosmic horror of their situation, the glowing mass began to rise. The iron storm was lifted. It wasn't a sudden jolt. It was a slow, inexorable elevation. The black water bulged upward, forming a massive, gentle dome beneath the hull, lifting the ship 10, 20, 30 feet into the dead, gray air. They were balanced on the apex of a watery hill, supported by the immense pressure of the creature rising from the depths. Men screamed as the ship tilted dangerously. They scrambled for handholds, grabbing ropes, the mast, the gunwales desperately trying not to slide off the deck and down the slick slope of water into the boiling abyss below. "Hold on!" Kaelen roared, wrapping his arm around a sturdy rigging line. "Do not fall. Do not let it take you." The glowing green flesh broke the surface. It did not emerge with a splash. The water simply slid off it, revealing a texture that was simultaneously smooth like wet rubber and deeply grooved like the bark of a rotting tree. It pulsed with that sickening green light, a biological bioluminescence that hurt the eyes to look at. And then, the surface of the creature began to split open. Fissures, hundreds of feet long, tore across the pale flesh with a sound like wet canvas tearing. They weren't mouths. They had no teeth. They were deep, dark chasms that opened into the glowing interior of the beast. From these chasms, the appendages emerged. They were the same pale, multi-jointed limbs that had taken young Ulf, but there were hundreds of them, thousands. They writhed and coiled in the gray air, thick as ancient tree trunks, glowing with that same sickly light. They moved with a slow, hypnotic grace, reaching blindly toward the sky, toward the ship precariously above them. "Harchers!" Eirik screamed, panic finally shattering his discipline. Fire. Fire at the limbs. 5 men managed to notch arrows to their bows. They fired down into the mass of writhing tentacles. The arrows struck the pale flesh. Some bounced off. A few sank deep. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't roar in pain. It didn't even seem to notice. The arrows were less than mosquito bites to a mountain. One of the massive appendages, thicker than the iron storm itself, slowly arched upward, looming over the deck like a pale, glowing tower. It blotted out the gray sky. Got it H cowers. It blotted out the gray sky. The appendage descended, but not with a crushing blow. It moved gently, deliberately. The tip of the limb, which was flat and soft like the pad of a giant thumb, pressed against the center of the deck, right over the main hatch. The wood of the ship groaned under the impossible weight. The deck planks bowed inward, splintering and cracking. "Get back!" Kaelen yelled, pulling Eric away from the center of the ship. The appendage didn't smash the ship. It simply rested there, applying a steady, unbearable pressure. It was testing them, testing the strength of their wooden shell. And then, the madness truly took hold. As the glowing limb pressed down, a sound began to emanate from it. It wasn't a physical sound. It was a psychic intrusion, a frequency that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly inside the skulls of the crew. It was a chorus of voices, thousands of voices, overlapping, whispering, crying, laughing, and among the cacophony, Kaelen heard them. The voices of the dead. He heard Torvald, the man whose crushed skull had been spat up, laughing a wet, gurgling laugh. He heard Ulf, the boy who had surrendered to the deep, whispering about how warm the water was. He heard the 10 men lost in the storm, screaming in endless, drowning agony. "Make it stop!" Torstein screamed, dropping to his knees and clutching his head. Blood began to trickle from his nose. "I hear them. I hear the drowned." Men collapsed on the deck, weeping, tearing at their hair. The psychic pressure was cracking their minds like eggshells. They were strong against steel, but they had no defense against the invasive, cosmic despair of the Leviathan. Eric fell beside Kaelen, his eyes rolling back in his head. "They are hungry, Kaelen," he gasped, blood seeping from his ears. "They say." Kaelen hauled his second in command to his feet, though his own vision was blurring, his head pounding with the horrific chorus. "Do not listen to them. Focus on my voice." But Eric was gone. The irises had dilated, swallowing the white, turning into twin pools of black ink. Eric smiled. It was the same serene, terrifying smile Ulf had worn before he jumped. Eric whispered. He raised his spear, but not toward the monster. He turned the iron tip toward his own throat. "Eric, no!" Kaelen lunged, grabbing the shaft of the spear. But Eric possessed a sudden, unnatural strength. He shoved Kaelen backward with a force that sent the Jarl crashing into the gunwale. Eric didn't hesitate. With a swift, brutal motion, he drove the spear upward, through his own neck. Blood sprayed across the deck, hot and red, stark against the glowing green light of the monster. Eric collapsed, gurgling, his black eyes fixed on the sky, smiling as he died. Kaelen stared in horror. He looked around his ship. The madness was spreading like wildfire. Torstein had drawn his knife and was carving deep, jagged runes into his own forearms, laughing hysterically. Another man was trying to chew through the rigging rope, his teeth shattering. 3 men had linked arms and simply walked off the edge of the tilted deck, sliding down the watery slope into the waiting chasm of glowing flesh below. The crew of the Iron Storm, 56 of the finest warriors of the North, were tearing themselves apart without the creature ever having to strike a blow. "Fight it!" Kaelen roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He struck the deck with the flat of his sword. "Remember who you are. You are Vikings. You do not break." But his voice was drowned out by the psychic chorus in their heads. The Leviathan didn't need to crush their bodies. It was crushing their will to exist. It was showing them the absolute insignificance of their lives in the face of an eternity of cold, dark chaos. The massive appendage resting on the deck shifted. It dragged its soft, glowing tip across the wooden planks, leaving a trail of thick, translucent slime that smoked and hissed as it ate into the wood. The appendage moved toward Kaelen. It loomed over him, a pillar of pale flesh and pulsing black veins. The psychic noise reached a deafening crescendo in his mind, a scream that threatened to tear his sanity apart. Kaelen stood his ground. He did not run. He did not drop his sword. He looked up at the impossible mass of the creature. "Kaelen of Kattegat," he screamed at the monstrosity, defiance burning in his chest even as his mind fractured. "I do not kneel to worms. I do not break." He swung his heavy iron sword with every ounce of strength he had left, aiming for the pulsing black vein visible beneath the translucent skin of the appendage. The blade struck. It was like hitting a wall of solid rubber. The iron edge bit shallowly into the flesh, releasing a spray of that black, foul-smelling ichor. Psychic chorus in Kaelen's head suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was jarring, absolute. The appendage recoiled slightly, not in pain. A shallow cut was nothing to a creature of this size, but in surprise. The tiny speck of salt and memory had bitten back. Then, the true horror began. The water beneath the ship, the massive dome holding them aloft, suddenly lost its tension. The Leviathan was diving. The iron storm dropped. The 60-foot fall felt like an eternity. The ship slammed into the black water with a concussive force that shattered the remaining oars, snapped the mast in two, and threw Kaelen violently against the hull. Water flooded over the gunwales. The ship groaned, the weakened, acid-eaten wood finally giving way. The keel cracked with the sound of thunder. The iron storm was breaking apart. Kaelen lay on the slanted, sinking deck, the freezing black water washing over his legs. He looked out at the ocean. The glowing green mass was sinking rapidly, returning to the abyss, dragging the swirling black water down with it. The vortex created by the creature's descent was massive. A whirlpool half a mile wide formed around the sinking ship, a spiraling funnel of black water pulling everything toward the center. Men were screaming in the water, caught in the pull, swirling helplessly as they were dragged down into the throat of the abyss. Kaelen grabbed a shattered piece of the mast, clinging to it as the ship tore itself to pieces beneath him. The cold was absolute. The darkness was absolute. The whirlpool caught the wreckage. Kaelen was pulled into the spin, the black water rushing past his face, deafening him. He was being dragged down into the dark, toward the glowing green light that was fading into the depths. The Leviathan had woken up, tasted their madness, and now it was taking them home to the dark. Kaelen took one last, deep breath of the stale, metallic air before the black water pulled him under. The ocean does not scream, it crushes. As the whirlpool dragged Kaelen down, the roar of the rushing water faded, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. The pressure built instantly, squeezing his chest like a giant iron fist. His eardrums popped with a sharp, stinging pain. The cold was absolute, a physical assault that turned his blood to slush in seconds. He was spinning in the dark, tumbling deeper and deeper into the throat of the abyss. He clung to the shattered piece of the mast, not out of hope, but out of pure animal instinct. He opened his eyes. The salt burned, but he didn't blink. Below him, fading into the infinite black, was the Leviathan. The glowing green light of the creature illuminated the underwater world for a fleeting second, and in that second, Kaelen saw the truth. The creature was not just a beast, it was a carrier. On the vast, grooved back of the Leviathan, amidst the forests of writhing tentacles and pulsing veins, Kaelen saw shapes. They looked like ships, hundreds of them. There were Viking longships, their hulls crushed and broken. There were strange, massive vessels with square sails he did not recognize. There were things that looked like iron whales. All of them were trapped in the slime and flesh of the creature's back, caught like flies in amber. And around the wreckage, floating in the green light, were the sailors. Thousands of them. Their bodies were pale, bloated, and preserved. They drifted tethered to the beast by thin, translucent cords of flesh that grew from their navels, connecting them to the monster. They were not dead. Their eyes were open. Their mouths were moving, silently screaming bubbles into the crushing dark. They were batteries. They were food. They were eternal prisoners. Kaelen watched as the wreck of the Iron Storm, his beautiful, proud ship, drifted down. It landed softly on the creature's back, settling into the slime. The tentacles rose up to embrace it, welding the wood to the flesh. He saw Eric's body drift past, the spear still sticking out of his neck. A thin, pale tendril shot out from the creature's skin and attached itself to Eric's chest. Eric's dead black eyes suddenly blinked. His arms twitched. He joined the colony. Kaelen screamed, expelling the last of his air. A plume of silver bubbles rushed upward. His lungs burned. Darkness closed in around the edges of his vision. He waited for the tentacle. He waited to be harvested. It sank lower, taking its city of the dead with it. The green light faded to a pinprick, then vanished. Kaelen was left alone in the absolute dark. He should have died. The pressure should have stopped his heart, but the ocean was not done with him. The piece of mast he was clinging to, wood from the sacred grove of Uppsala, blessed by the old priest, suddenly surged upward. It was buoyant, lighter than the heavy, cursed water. Kaelen shot toward the surface. He broke the water with a gasp that sounded like a tearing sail. He vomited black seawater, coughing, retching, his body shaking so violently his teeth cracked. He was alive. There was only the flat, black ocean, the gray sky, and a single man clinging to a piece of driftwood in the center of nothing. "Take me," Kaelen rasped, slamming his fist into the water. "Finish it." But the ocean did not answer. The Leviathan had fed. It had taken what it wanted. Kaelen, defiant, broken, insignificant, was not worth the effort. He was rejected by the abyss. 6 weeks later, the merchant ship White Falcon, bound for Iceland, was blown off course by a freak southerly wind. The captain, a pragmatic man named Bjornar, was navigating through a patch of dense fog when the lookout shouted, "Debris off the starboard bow." Drifting in the mist was a piece of shattered timber. It looked like the top of a mast, and tied to it, lashed with strips of leather and dried kelp, was a figure. "Lower a boat," Bjornar ordered. "Whatever it is, it looks human." The sailors rowed out to the debris. As they got closer, they stopped rowing. The air around the driftwood smelled. It smelled of ozone and ancient copper. The figure on the raft was moving. It was sitting cross-legged, staring at the horizon. "Hello?" One of the sailors called out. The figure turned its head slowly. The sailors gasped. It was a man, or it had been. His skin was translucent, pale as jellyfish flesh. You could see the dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. His hair had fallen out, replaced by patches of gray scales. Barnacles grew on his shoulders and neck, but it was his eyes that made the sailors recoil. The sockets were empty, filled only with black seawater that didn't spill out. "Who are you?" the sailor whispered, terrified. The thing on the raft opened its mouth. Its teeth were black. Its tongue was swollen and purple. Kaelen, it rasped. The voice sounded like grinding stones. "Jarl of the Iron Storm." The sailors knew the name. The Iron Storm had vanished months ago. It was a legend, a ghost ship. "Get him aboard," the sailor said, his voice shaking. "We have to take him to the healer." They dragged Kaelen onto the White Falcon. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He simply sat on the deck, dripping black water that stained the wood. Bjornar knelt before him. "Kaelen, where is your ship? Where is your crew?" Kaelen turned his empty, watery sockets toward the captain. He smiled. "They are sleeping," Kaelen whispered. "In the garden." "Garden?" Bjornar asked. "What garden?" Kaelen leaned forward. He grabbed Bjornar's wrist. His grip was ice cold and stronger than iron. "The map is wrong, Captain," Kaelen hissed. "The ocean, it has no bottom." "What do you mean?" Bjornar tried to pull away, but Kaelen held fast. "We think the sea is a floor," Kaelen said, his voice rising, bubbling with madness. "We sail on it. We fish in it. We think it is a place." Kaelen leaned closer until his stench filled Bjornar's nose. "It is not a floor. It is a lid." Bjornar froze. "And it is waking up," Kaelen whispered. With that, Kaelen released the captain's wrist. He slumped back against the mast. He closed his mouth. He never spoke again. He simply sat on the deck, staring at the ocean with his empty eyes, rocking back and forth to a rhythm only he could hear. On the third night, while the watchman was looking away, Kaelen vanished. There was no splash, no cry, just a wet stain on the deck where he had been sitting, leading to the rail. He had gone back to the deep, back to his crew. Bjornar ordered the ship to turn around. He burned the spot where Kaelen had sat. He forbade his crew from speaking of what they had seen. But the story spread. In the taverns of Iceland, in the longhouses of Norway, the sailors whispered. They whispered of the Iron Storm. They whispered of the Black Ocean. And they whispered of the warning. The ocean is a lid. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the sea is flat as glass and the stars are hidden by clouds, sailors will lean over the rail and listen. And if they listen closely enough, beneath the lap of the waves, beneath the creak of the hull, they can hear it. Thump, 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 something massive testing the lid, waiting to come out.